the next in our Judges series. We're going through the book of Judges as a church at the moment, and we're coming up to Judges 9. And Judges 9 is it's an interesting chapter. It's all based around a man called Abimelech, and we're going to see that he was a man who, a bit like many politicians, promised a better future for the people if he gets into power. And we're seeing that at the moment, aren't we? We're seeing the battle rage all over the place. But we're also going to see that he too is potentially just as corrupt as many of today's politicians who promise lots but maybe don't follow through on some of the things they say. So Judges 9, 1-3, we read this. It says, Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to his mother's brothers in Shechem and said to them and to all his mother's clan, ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I am your flesh and blood. When the brothers repeated this to all the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is related to us. Now, Abimelech, so you're going to have to excuse me this morning. I'm going to go and die at home later. Abimelech was one of Gideon's 70 sons. So this is following on directly from what we looked at last week with Gideon. He's one of Gideon's sons from a harem of wives and concubines. And this is what's really interesting. Up until now, all the judges in the book of Judges have been appointed by God. But he wasn't appointed by God. And he doesn't deliver Israel from invaders as the previous leaders did. Abimelech, we find here, is an opportunist. And like we're going to see, is he took power through violence and treachery. So the reality is, he's what some call an anti-judge. So he's almost the opposite of what God wanted to install in the land to bring freedom. Because I say, nowhere do we find that Abimelech seems to acknowledge God. He doesn't. He's appointed himself. And we need to remember that the Jews, up until this point, have been fighting external enemies. But at this point, the battle changes. The enemies they're fighting are now internal. Okay? So that's similar to us having some kind of fighting in here as opposed to coming from outside. Someone outside disagreeing with us, but no, now it's someone inside who disagrees. We see a turn, what's happening here. And this man Abimelech seems to be taking advantage. And actually what happens is potentially far more dangerous than an external threat. Now, as you may know, sibling rivalry, for those of you that had a brother, sister, whatever it might be, has been something that has gone on for generations. Although I'm sure you all got on with brothers and sisters if you had them. But back in the time of the Bible, you had Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. There's been infighting for years. And Abimelech against his 70 siblings is no different. So what did he do? Well, he convinces the people of Shechem, which is his hometown, to crown him king. And what's really interesting is they crown him king, but it's only his hometown that crowns him king, whereas he almost assumes he's king of the whole land. But it's only his hometown. It's a bit like me convincing the people of West Moors to make me king of this country. And even if they agreed, it doesn't make me king of the whole country, even if I think I am. That's what he's doing, effectively, right now. And, you know, I almost won the Citizen of the Year award a few years ago in West Moors, where I came runner-up, which Chris liked to give me lots of grief about at the time. He obviously didn't vote enough for me, so but that's all right. I don't even know what I did to earn it at the time, the nomination, but I did. But this is what's happening with Abimelech here. And then we read this. Because what starts to happen is you've got this society in Shechem where they didn't know God, and you get this hybrid society. And it may sound very similar to what we've got now, because you've got this sort of theism where they want to worship God, but they don't, because it's mixed with idolatry. They mix the Jewish law with the pagan practices, and they end up with this kind of chaos situation where they kind of mean well, but they're doing it wrong. And it sounds a bit like today, doesn't it? You know, people will say, oh, I'm a Christian, I follow God, and yet the stuff they do doesn't seem very Christian because they've brought in other things and claiming it's Christian, but it's not really if you go back and look at what the Bible says. And so we start finding here, Judges 9:4, they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith. Now, you might think, who is Baal-berith? Well, Baal is a character we need to understand because the Hebrews, when they entered the promised land, God warned them against worshipping the Canaan's gods. In Deuteronomy, you read, Deuteronomy 6, 14 and 15, they were warned not to worship the gods of the land they were going into. But Israel turned to idolatry anyway. And Baal was the name of the supreme god of the land. He was the supreme god that was worshipped in ancient Canaan and Phoenicia. And so what they started to do is they come following their god, but brought in the gods of the tradition of the land. Doesn't that sound like today? You know, think about all the different gods in the world today. We've sort of brought them in and said, well, I'm a Christian, I follow God, but I do this as well. Or I believe this as well. But is that what God really says? Or is that what your tradition or your ideology says? We've ended up with the same world. You see, and what happens is the practice of Baal worship infiltrated Jewish religious life. And it wasn't long before it became widespread. As soon as one or two start doing it, it's amazing how many other people will think, oh, that's just normal, that's what we do. Last week I talked a bit about imitating and how we should imitate others. And as soon as one or two, maybe you say, I follow God, start doing some weird things, you'll start finding others start doing some weird things. Oh, that must be normal for Christians to do that and live like that because they're doing it and they're a Christian. You know, that's why for me, when, you know, if you follow the news, I don't know how many months ago it was, when it came out with the census, and the census in the UK said numbers of Christians are down. I was like, no, they've always been down. Just too many people ticked the box on the paper that said Christian when they weren't living as a Christian, because we're in a Christian country. And so actually, you're getting a closer representation to who is Christian, because I can tell you who's Christian by if they're following Jesus or not because they tick a box and they grew up in a Christian country and maybe went to a church school, or that's not what it is being a Christian. It's following Jesus. And so this Baal here that we find, the word Baal itself means Lord. And in general, this Baal was a fertility god who was believed to enable the earth to produce crops and people to produce children. And different regions of the land at the time worship Baal in different ways. And Baal proved to be a very highly adaptable god. Doesn't that sound, once again, a bit like the world we want today? Well, I want my God to like the things that I like or the things that I agree with. Oh, I don't like that bit in the Bible, but it's okay, I'll produce my own following. I'll ignore that bit. And so this is what this Baal was. They could worship in different ways depending on what they wanted. And so various areas emphasized one or other attributes. And they developed special doctrines of Baalism based on what they wanted. For example, Numbers 25:3 refers to Baal of Peor, and later it is known as Baal Berith in Judges. And so what happens is you find this god almost becomes localized depending on what the people are looking for at the time. And according to the Canaanite mythology, Baal was the son of El, the chief god, and Asherah, the goddess of the sea. But Baal was considered the most powerful of all the gods, eclipsing El, who was seen as rather weak and ineffective. And in various battles, so this is all in the Canaanite mythology, Baal defeats Yam, the god of the sea, and Mot, the god of death and the underworld. Baal's sisters were Ashtoreth, a fertility goddess associated with the stars, and Anath, the goddess of love and war. And as we know, because we've read it before, in Elijah, the story of Elijah we looked at, the Canaanites worship Baal as the sun god and as the storm god. And he's usually depicted holding a lightning bolt who defeats his enemies, and he produces crops as well. But Baal's worship was rooted in this sort of sensuality and involved ritualistic prostitution in the temples. And at times, appeasing Baal required human sacrifice. But one of the most famous incidents, of Baal was during the reign of Ahab when he was with Jezebel. And for those of you that were here when we did Elijah a bit earlier this year, there's this moment where God directly confronts paganism through his prophet Elijah. Because God showed that he, not Baal, was in charge. Remember, Baal was claimed to be this sun god. And there's this story that we read where Elijah confronts all these prophets. And he basically gets them to cool down fire. But yet the sun god was not able to cool fire down, despite all of these prophets doing their chanting and cutting themselves and everything else they were doing. And yet when Elijah calls on God, what happens? Fire comes down from heaven. And so that's who we're dealing with here. We're dealing with someone who the people believed produced what they needed. All of life revolved around Baal. And we might not call it Baal today, but we do lots of weird things in our country. And in many countries around the world where we say things as if, that's just the way things work. But all we're doing is we're worshipping someone often who is not God. But if we go back to our text in Judges 9:4, we see that the Israelites were involved in worshipping Baal Berith because money had come from the temple of Baal Berith. They created a temple for worshipping this god. And this name, Berith bit, literally means it's the Baal of the covenant, which is really ironic because the Israelites were meant to be in a covenant relationship with God. That's effectively like if you're married to someone and having in your home almost a little altar you've set up with pictures of another woman that you worship. That's weird, isn't it? And that's what these people were doing. They were meant to be in a covenant relationship with God, and yet they built tables and altars and were worshipping another god. And there's a lesson for us all. The reality is, what happens is if we start falling out of the covenant relationship with God, if he doesn't become the one we are following, what ends up happening is we will end up following someone else, and we will end up being ruled by people who are not forgiving, loving, merciful, gracious like God. And you see, this man Abimelech came along, and his claim to the throne was on the basis of being a son of Gideon. And remember, Gideon, in the previous chapter, he'd been offered kingship, but he turned it down. You see, but this man Abimelech, his motive wasn't to serve his people, it was to gain power. That's what he was doing. I mean, as a son of Gideon, his name literally meant, my father is king. And Abimelech felt he might take the throne his father declined. But there were many others. There were 70 of them. There were many other potential candidates, but Abimelech had a plan. And it's honestly, this story is hilarious. Judges 9:4-5 says, Abimelech used it to hire the money he'd been given, the 70 shekels. He used it to hire reckless scoundrels. I love that. It's just like, what? Where'd you find reckless scoundrels? I don't know where he's gone, but he's found this group of reckless scoundrels who became his followers. And he went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. So this man hires all these men and kills his brothers. He rounds them up and then somehow on one stone brutally and publicly executes his brothers with these reckless scoundrels. Yet, he was inspired by his father to lead Israel. But yet, even though he thinks he's following in his father's footsteps, all he's really doing is showing us hatred towards his father by murdering his brothers. He wanted to be king at any cost, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. Have you ever met people like that who have got so driven by an agenda that they will do anything, and anyone who stands in their way, they are cannon fodder to them? They will run you down at all costs because they want to be in power. They want to be top dog. They want to make decisions. They want to rule. And it doesn't matter how many people I hurt along the way, as long as I make it to the top. But in all of this that was going on, there was one brother who he didn't murder. Judges 9:5 says, but Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. It's always the youngest, isn't it? So if you are the youngest, you seem to always get away or seem to make a difference. So everyone else, you're pretty much doomed. But the youngest always seems to do pretty well in these things. Of the 70 brothers, Jotham escapes. And he then goes and addresses the people of Shechem on top of Mount Gerizim and shares a fable with them. And this fable is really, really odd to those of us who don't read Middle Eastern prophetic literature. If you're into your English, you would get loads from this. If you like something much more linear like me, this might sound a bit weird to you. But this is what he said. He said one day, so take into account all these people don't like him right now, and he stands up and talks down to his people. He said one day, the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. Sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? They said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But the olive tree answered, "Should I give up my oil, by which both gods and humans are honored, to hold sway over the trees?" So next the trees said to the fig tree, "Come, be our king." But the fig tree replied, "Should I give up my fruit, so good and sweet, to hold sway over the trees?" Then the tree said to the vine, "Come and be our king." But the vine answered, "Should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and humans, to hold sway over the trees?" So finally, all the trees said to the thorn bush, "Come and be our king." The thorn bush said to the trees, "If you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let the fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon." Weird, isn't it? Jotham's name means God is blameless, honest, and filled with integrity, which is the exact opposite of Abimelech, who we're finding here. Two brothers who seem to be the exact opposite. And Jotham's fable he tells is about these three valuable trees which were native to Israel, which are all offered kingship but refuse. However, at the end of his sort of prophetic story he tells, the thorn bush accepts the position and he replies, and I read it already, he says, "If you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade." Now, the thorn bush represents Abimelech in this story. And I don't know about you, have you ever tried to take shade under a thorn bush? Anyone? No? If you do, it probably doesn't go well, because one, a thorn bush will have gaps in it, so if there's any rain or anything, it'll fall on you. And also, thorn bushes tend to have thorns in them. Okay? You try and take shade under a thorn bush, it probably is not going to go too well for you, because you're not going to get a lot of comfort or protection from a thorn bush. You might get some, but not as many as other plants. And so Jotham continues to drive home his point in Judges 9, 19 and 20, where he asks some rhetorical questions to the people, and he says, "So, have you acted honorably and in good faith toward Jerubbaal?" Remember, Jerubbaal was the name they'd given Gideon. That's who we're talking about, not another Baal here, and his family today. Have you acted honorably towards them? If you have, may Abimelech be your joy, and may you be his too. But if you have not, then let fire come out from Abimelech and consume you, the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo. And let fire come out from you, the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and consume Abimelech. See, Jotham wanted to warn these people. He wanted to let them know that it'd be madness to make this man Abimelech your king. You will literally die and he will literally die. This is crazy. He wants to let you know that you are going to reap the consequences and you will suffer under his rule. Now, you may wonder at this point, well, why did God let this happen? Well, let me be honest. If you spend too much time in the world and in the presence of wickedness and in the presence of people who don't follow God, you will ultimately become like them. If you don't spend enough time with people who follow Jesus, you will live like people who don't follow Jesus. You know, there are times, and I've said it before, where we think we can change people by our conduct and speech. And remember, we do want to see people saved. We have to spend time with people who don't know Jesus, because Jesus came for the lost, didn't he? However, if all we ever do is spend time with people who are lost, we will act more like them than they will act like us. You know, if you have a barrel full of rotten apples and you put a good apple into that barrel, is that good apple going to turn all those bad apples good? No. The bad apples are going to make the good apple bad. There's a balance. There's a balance. We can't spend only our time with people who follow Jesus, because then we're missing out when Jesus said, "Now go and make disciples of all nations." And we become just weird. But we also can't spend all our time with people who don't follow Jesus, because in the end we'll end up becoming like them and thinking what's not the way of Jesus is normal. It's a balancing act. We've got to find that balance. You know, in Proverbs 12:26 tells me this. It says, "The righteous choose their friends carefully, but the way of wicked leads them astray." Also in Proverbs 13:20 it says, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." And Paul warns us in 1 Corinthians 15:33. It says, "Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character." You see, God's people have become like the Canaanites in this story, in their character. Rather than stand for God, they'd compromised. They spent too much time with the people. They broke their covenant and adjusted to the values of this godless culture. We have to be on guard as well, don't we? Against being shaped by our culture, especially when leaders don't model godly behavior. You know, all you've got to do is watch the news. We live in a godless world, don't we? I'm not being funny. Whether it's wars or whether it's, various ideologies that are being pressed right now in the world, we live in a country which is so far from God, it's unbelievable. We've got to be careful that we don't get shaped by our culture, but we're being shaped by Jesus. Now let me ask you, do people like Abimelech still reign today? You might think no. Well, they have in the past. Let's think of someone like Adolf Hitler. Like Abimelech, he hated his father, and he rose to political power by eliminating opponents and by making deals with power structures. And it was only after he attained control did the people gradually realize how evil he was. You see, when leaders serve self and reject good, it feels like evil is in control and God is absent. And yet we wonder if and when we will be delivered and how we will ever recover. We may even wonder why God seems to be doing nothing. Yet, a little story here. I don't know if you know anything about the American Indians, but the American Indians had a bit of a rite of passage for their youngsters, for training their young braves. See, on the night of a boy's 13th birthday, I think we should go back to this, but I think this is brilliant. On the night of a boy's 13th birthday, after learning hunting, scouting, and fishing skills, they're put to one final test. He's placed in a dense forest to spend the entire night alone. And up until this point, this boy has never been alone. He's never been away from the security of his family and his tribe. But on this night, he's blindfolded and taken several miles away. And when he takes off the blindfold, he's in the middle of thick woods and often terrified. And every time a twig snaps, can you imagine this? Just imagine yourself in that place. You've never been there before. It's dark, you know no one. And every time a twig snaps, you visualize a wild animal ready to pounce, ready to attack. And after what seems like an eternity, dawn breaks. And then you start to see the sunlight, those very first rays start coming through the clouds, start coming through the trees, getting into the interior of the forest. And as you start looking around, you start to see the flowers, the trees themselves, the outline of the path. And then what often happened is, to the utter astonishment of the child, there's a figure of a man standing just a few feet away, armed with a bow and arrow. And that person was his father. He'd been there all night long with him, yet he couldn't see him. You see, it's during those times of hardship, and we've been praying for battles this morning, and there's lots of battles we are facing in this room, and maybe even some that people don't want to admit yet, but they are. We can't lose hope in God, because he's often right there next to us, even if we don't seem to see him. It's during those times of evil ruling that our God is still sovereign over human events, which move according to his predetermined outcome and timetable. And just like Abimelech, not his father, but our Father is king. God is king. God is always in control. And so God rose up in opposition to Abimelech. You see, in Jotham's prophetic fable, he stated that fire will come from the thorn bush and consume the people. And this is what we read in Judges 9:49. After this fable, it says this: So all the men cut branches and followed Abimelech. They piled them against the stronghold and set it on fire with the people still inside. So all the people in the tower of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women, also died. See, Jotham's fable was fulfilled, and the people did reap consequences for choosing such an evil king. But then watch what happens to Abimelech in this, because you might be thinking, this is terrible, evil rules. But Judges 9:52-54 tells us this. It says, Abimelech went to the tower and attacked it. But as he approached the entrance to the tower to set it on fire, a woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. Love the way it says it. Hurriedly, he called to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so they can't say a woman killed him." So his servant ran him through and he died. Abimelech's death ultimately came at the hand of a lady, not a soldier. And she was using a farming implement. This upper millstone was, they had two stones where they crushed the grain. And it was the one she would be on top. She would crush the grain all day, every day. He was killed by a kitchen implement, effectively, back in the day. Abimelech, this mighty warrior king who he thought he was killed by a kitchen implement. Once again, the Bible assures us that God may allow people to attain public office, but he can also remove them when he chooses. See, when you look at the world today, and when we look at some of the leaders in the world, I don't know about you, you have to wonder, what on earth is going on? And there may be times when we're ruled by Abimelechs, and we may wonder how we're going to survive. Well, the Bible's very clear what our response should be at this time. It's to pray for them. The scriptures command us to uphold our elected officials. 1 Timothy 2 says, "I urge you then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness." Romans 13, it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." The authorities that exist have been established by God. See, it was God who put the idea of government into practice. And we've got to respect that. And we've got to pray for these people. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we need to agree with everything they say. But it's the way we disagree is important. Because Ephesians 4:15 says, "Speak the truth in love." And that applies to all areas in life. If someone's not doing something right, speak the truth in love. See, God promises to deal with evil, but it's in his time frame, not ours. All you've got to do is look at some of the riots that are going on today in the news. People are trying to exert their own justice. What do? We need to pray right now. We need to be praying for what's going on. But not just in the world. I just want to ask you a question. How do you see the leadership here at Pinehurst? It's a tough question. You might not know who all the leadership are. We have elders. We have a wider leadership team. Most of us didn't necessarily come from perfect backgrounds. Some of them might know the Bible better than others. And we have many people in places of leadership in the church. And the point I want to drive home for you today is, while it's important for you to pray for your political leaders, I want to encourage you also to pray for your spiritual leaders. Really important. All you've got to do is, even in the world of the church, how many church leaders have we seen fall in the past few years? I can name them for you. And it is desperately sad. I wouldn't name them because I'm saying, look how terrible they are. I would name them because I'd say, please pray for me. Please pray for me. Because any one of us could fall. See, we have leaders here who are shepherding. We have leaders who are looking after the physical and spiritual needs of the church. Let me just share with you quick, interesting facts about a bird called the sandhill crane. Now, these are large birds who fly great distances across continents. And they have three remarkable qualities. First, they rotate leadership. They always fly together. They rotate leadership. No one bird stays out in front all the time. If you see them, they're in this sort of V shape through the sky. But no one bird stays out in the front all the time. Second, they choose leaders who can handle turbulence. And then, during the whole time that one bird is leading, all the others are honking their affirmation. Now, as a church, there's some amazing leaders here, but we need the whole church for the amazing leaders to operate. We need leaders who can handle turbulence, especially when there are people who come and want to cause division and turbulence in the church. We need leaders that are aware that leadership ought to be shared. Fortunately, we have a leadership team. We believe in plurality of leadership. I love the fact there's plurality of leadership. But it's a sad fact that so many churches are totally reliant on one person to do everything. Unfortunately, those churches will live and fall on that one leader. If that leader gets taken out, that's it, everything falls. And the reality is, with churches like that, they expect the leader, whoever it is, someone in my position, to organise everything, to do all the preaching, to do all the visiting the sick, to do everything. The reality is, you don't need to be a leader to visit the sick or to organise an event. Anyone can do it. If you're waiting for me to do it, it's not going to happen. Why do you think, as I said before, we've got more women's events than men's events? Because the women get up and do something and organise it. The men don't. So men, don't complain that the women went out for a breakfast yesterday. Organise something. Don't wait for me to do it. But thirdly, most importantly, we need to be a church where we're all honking encouragement to those who are in leadership roles. And what I want to do to finish today is I want to ask you, if you're in a leadership role in the church, stand up. That could be a life group leader, that could be a leader, that could be leading a kids' work, it could be anything. I will call you out if you don't stand, so don't worry. That's the kind of leader I'm honking at you. Okay? Now, these aren't all the leaders. These are some of the leaders. Some of them are already serving in other areas. Where's Charlie? She's one. She's disappeared. Oh, see, she's sort of doing teas and coffees. There's others. I decided I'm not going to name them all because I'll always forget one if you name them. There's a leadership lesson there for you. Don't put people in a list and name them out publicly. You always forget one. These are leaders. And what we're going to do to finish today, because a good church will rise and fall in its leaders. We've done a lot of praying today. I want you to go and pray for these people. Go and ask them where they lead and go and pray for them. And as soon as we've done that, Holly and the band are going to come back and we're going to sing a final song together. But Holly's not coming up till she's been prayed for, so you better get to her quickly. So look around, find them standing, go and pray for them. These are leaders. They need your encouragement. They need your blessing. They need to know that what they are doing is for God and not themselves, and we need them to lead well. Go pray.